I'm going to take you through the outfit that I'm going to make this week. I'm going to start with pants pattern by Simplicity 9755. I am going to make this version C, the pants pattern, and I'm going to pair it with this indie pattern, the Sofie Sweetheart tank by Stay Stitch. The Stay Stitch pattern is super beginner friendly. It's made with knits, and the pants is supposed to be made with a non-stretch denim, but I am making it with a stretch denim, so there will be a little bit of fit that I have to do at the end to make it work. I have made the pattern before. I made 2 of the skirt version, so I'm somewhat familiar with the process before I begin. I have it all cut out and it's ready to go, so let's get started. There is what I would consider to be a pattern mistake with this pattern that I'd like to call your attention to before you cut it out. I made the skirt version twice, and both times I ended up taking some of it in at the sides. And then when I went to do the facing, that should be the exact same amount, I didn't have to take as much in on the facing. So I feel like in my experience of making it twice now, because it happened both times, that I really didn't end up having to take much in on the facing after taking in a lot on the skirt. So I feel like the facing is not quite cut right and is a bit too small. So just bear that in mind as you're cutting it out, that also, when we get to that step, I baste the facing together before I sew it and line it up to see if, I think if you are the exact same size as you make, you'll be able to let out the seams on the facing to match it, but that's a bit of a kind of an iffy process. Luckily, they're small pieces, so if you end up having to cut a bigger one, you should be able to cut it out of scraps if you have a little bit. And also, if you get into a bind where you literally have no fabric, it doesn't show, so you can use scrap fabric if you get into that bind as well. But step 1 of the process of making this is to stay stitch the top of 3 of the pattern pieces. So if you're making the pants or the shorts, it's 20, 23, and 22. Are the ones that you're going to stay stitch the top. You're going to stay stitch towards the center of the garment on each one of the pattern pieces. And stay stitch is essentially just a stitch you don't have to lock and finish, but what it's trying to do is hold the garments or the fabric's stretch from taking over, since especially because this is stretchy, but even if you're using a woven, there is sometimes a little bit of a give. So we want that to hold still so it doesn't stretch as we're sewing it. So I'm going to do that stitching on all 6 of these pattern pieces. We are on to the point where we are going to start assembling the fly front. So with piece 20, they want you to transfer this mark, and essentially you're going to be stitching from here to here. And you're just reinforcing this section that will take a lot of stress on the fly. They also want you to transfer this mark. I don't do that, and I'm not going to do that, but this will be the first step on assembling the front fly. Here you see my mark. I'm going to do some pinning, and then I'm going to take it over to the machine and stitch from here down to here and reinforce. Then they do actually want you to cut to this point. I have found that I didn't need to with the skirts that I made of this version, so I'm going to continue not doing that. You're going to want to keep a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Here is our progress so far. We have these 2 front pieces, and the only thing that's really sewn together is this. I did serge this, which makes me lose my notches, but it's pretty easy to hold the pattern piece back up and figure out where they are and or just transfer them. But I have found from making it twice that I prefer at this stage to have that finished. So here's where we're at now. Next, we're gonna start adding the zipper. It requires a 7-inch zipper. My recommendation is that whatever zipper that you buy has a very small pull attached to it. Since I've made it twice before, the fly shield doesn't go over super far, And so I just wouldn't recommend a very bulky one at all for this particular garment. Just for demonstrative purposes, these are the two skirts that I've made in the pattern so far. This is the exact same fabric. And as you can see, there just is not a ton of coverage. And I selected a small one, luckily too, for this one. And once again, it peeks very easily out if you would have anything that was much larger than these. So here's a fashion zipper that's the same length, and then the one that I'm recommending. And you can see this is what I used. I would not recommend anything that big. So I would also always test your zipper before you install it, because both my mother and I have put in zippers that are not working. And I can't tell you the level of frustration you will have if you put in a zipper you did not test and find out that it is for some reason not working. Here are the next couple of steps. I'm going to go and press down on the left pattern piece 3/8 of an inch down here. There is a fold line that is on the pattern piece that you can use for reference if you want. I find I just measure and press, and this will be the first step towards putting in our zipper. Once I have that pressed, I am going to put, I prefer to use Wonder Tape. So I'm going to put Wonder Tape along this edge, and I am going to stick it to the garment along here. And I've been top stitching over and over again. You're actually only supposed to baste. So you're supposed to baste this in place once you get to that part, because your next step is to assemble the fly, the left fly. A lot of patterns will call this a fly shield, and this is the piece of fabric that will be between you and the zipper to keep yourself from zipping yourself into the zipper. So I've made a lot of patterns that don't have these, and I have zipped myself into my zipper a time or two. So the next step will be to put right sides together on this. This is pattern piece 11. And so at the top at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and so at the bottom along this curve at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then I do, it doesn't instruct you to, but I prefer to then trim the seam allowance because I feel like it turns better. So then I will be turning it right side out once it's stitched, and they want you to baste along this edge. I'm just gonna serge it. They also want you to finish it, but I'm not gonna baste, I'm just gonna serge. So those are the next couple of steps. I do prefer to always kind of lay the fabric out similar to what's in the pattern so that I don't mess up. I'm just a very visual person. So this is the right side of the garment. This is the right side of the garment. I have it laid out. I can see that I pressed the accurate side, and I'm going to end up taping my zipper to this side, and this will be my first step. So this is Wonder Tape. I found this to be my favorite tool to use when I am installing zippers. Looks like it's lost its stickiness. So I'm going to put it on the zipper tape. It's a two-sided tape that will adhere both of them, and if you read carefully when you purchase it and purchase the type that washes away, eventually this will just wash away as the garment is laundered. So get that nice end on there, and then peel off the backing. Now, there is a mark on your pattern piece. You do not want your zipper pull to be all the way at the top, because the top of this seam allowance is going to get taken into the facing seam eventually. So you really do want your zipper to be 5/8 inch down so you can follow the marks on the pattern. I'm actually just going to line up the top of my fabric with the top of the zipper tape. And you can pin this if you would like to. I'm actually not going to, because I've found that I don't need to. And the pattern wants you to baste along here. I've been top stitching and then just top stitching over again, and either way works. Put your zipper foot in, make sure you've moved your needle over so that your needle doesn't crash down into your foot, because that's one of the fastest ways of breaking a needle. All right, I'm going to trim these, and I'm going to turn it right side out, and then I'm going to serge along this edge. So we have this prepared now. Obviously I've cut off all of my notch markings. I know from my experience that this thing cannot be up here. It will get trapped in the facing seam. It's why we finished the top of this. So it's actually going to be aligned with the top of the zipper. You want it to be aligned with this seam back here. And so essentially it's gonna look like this. And if you basted, now you're going to officially stitch. If you stitched, you're just gonna stitch over your stitching again. I am going to use my Wonder Tape again because I absolutely love it and I feel like it's a game changer in the sewing room. So I'm going to add it to the back of this here so that it all stays put together when I take it over to the sewing machine. Actually, I'm gonna have to go to here. Okay, that is all taped on. You can see how that lines up real nicely. So I'm going to stitch that down in place. And then the next is going to be addressing this side of the fly. The fly shield is now sewn into place. And the next step is this fly shield, which they ask you to, first you need to interface it. So I have the interfacing already ironed on. And then they ask you to finish this edge. I do both of these. They're very specific, do not cut off any. Then it's gonna go right sides together with this side. And it's gonna be sewn all the way down basically to where that point was that we made to begin with. So it's right sides together. It's a 5/8 inch seam allowance. With this one, I know I don't have my notches anymore, but this can line up with the top. So see how this one is down below? This one can line up with the top and it can have it go into the seam allowance for the facing. Here it is all pinned together and ready to go. So I'm gonna add that seam in. Then I will be doing the understitch. The stitching is done, and now I'm gonna press it like this and stitch right along here, catching both the seam allowance and this inch, and that's called understitching. And I'm gonna do it all along there so that this will lay really nicely and it will pull this fly shield back a little bit. That's the purpose of understitching. So I'm gonna put my wonder tape along here, and then I'm gonna line this up, making sure this area looks good really nicely, and I'm gonna finger press this down. And what that will do is that will adhere this to just this tape, because in my next stitching, I wanna get just this and just this stitched together. And I wanna keep this and this and this all out of the way. All right, the tape is in. Now I'm going to line this up as nicely as possible. Now, if I pull it back, you see that the zipper is taped to this piece right where we want it. So now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew along here and get just this tape on just this fly shield. Okay, once again, right before I stitch it, I'm stitching just this to just this. So I'm going to keep all of this pinched out of the way and sew right along here. All right, that is all stitched together now, and you have a functioning fly. Normally, in many pants patterns that I've made, the next step would be to do the top stitching here that would basically keep this fly shield connected, and it gives you that nice top stitching. With this particular pattern, they don't have you do that. This happens much later near the end. For fitting purposes and stuff like that, you're gonna have to, you have two choices. You can baste along here to keep the pants secured like that, or like if you're like me, you just leave it, and then when you go to fit it and stuff like that, you'll put a pin here to hold it into position so that you get a good idea of what the fit looks like. But this is totally done, and now we're gonna move on to doing the two side panels. The next step is, for the pants, it's 21 and 13, and it's essentially putting right sides together to begin the step-by-step process to create the pockets. So you would lay these right sides together like this, and then you're gonna do a 5/8 inch seam along here, and then everything's gonna get pressed to this direction, so both the seam allowance and this, and then there will be understitched along here, like right here, understitched like this, and then all of it will get pressed back under like this, and this will start to create your pocket. They're pinned together and ready for the stitching. So this is where we're at. It is stitched together, it is serged, and then it is understitched. And all of this was pressed up that direction in order to stitch that all together. And now I've just pressed it this way. So the next piece is this number 14, and these turn into essentially the pocket bags. And it will finish the rest of this to complete that side. So this will go right sides together, just like this. And the only place that you stitch for these is you're gonna sew along here. You're not gonna do anything as far as finishing the sides. You're just gonna sew along here, and then I will actually serge this edge. And then once that's in, we're just going to baste along these sides. Once it's all lined up properly, we'll baste along both sides, and then it will be prepared to be sewn onto that middle section that contains the zipper fly. All right, once these are totally assembled, all I have left to do is the basting stitches here and here and here. Now I will put these right sides together and sew all the way along here for both of them. Then I will be pressing my seam allowance towards the center. So once it's pressed towards the center like this, then I'll be top stitching. So this side is ready to be assembled, but this side, I've already sewn it together. I serged it, I pressed it towards the center, towards the crotch, and then I top stitched it. So just remember whatever the distance is that you did here for consistency, because you're gonna do this again over here and twice on the back. So now I'm gonna put right sides together for these two, and I'm gonna repeat the same process. I'm gonna sew them together, then I'm going to serge them, and then I'm gonna press them towards the center, and then I'm gonna top stitch to give it that really nice clean look. Okay, so here is the progress so far. The front is finished, and now we move on to the back. All right, step one of the back is going to be to put the right sides together of both of these sides. So this is the center back, side back, side back. So it's going to be the same process of what we just did on the front. We're going to line these up. We are going to sew them. Then we're going to serge that edge. Then we're going to press the seam allowance towards the center and do that top stitching, and essentially mirror what we did for the front. On the back, got one of the back panels together, and it's exactly the same as the front in the sense that you put right sides together, top stitch, and finish. So this will be this side right here. So I've got the other back panel to do, and then I have serged the top of the pockets. There's a fold line that's on the pattern piece. So what they want you to do is fold along that and then go stitch all the way around. The reason that you'd stitch all the way around is at the seam allowances because it makes it easier to just fold along that stitch line. You don't have to. The alternative is to just stitch along the seam allowance on both sides, and then that way you can flip it right side out and it's neat and tidy, and then you could press the rest of this. So I did that. So for the carriers, they want you to press with it folded in half. And then once you have a good crease in there, they want you to fold in again using that crease line as a guide on both sides. And what you're trying to accomplish is to get it nice and pressed like this. And then you'll add your stitching lines to create a nice line that you'll then cut up to use as your carriers. All right, now I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch a stitching line along each edge to finish it off. There is the carriers all ready to be cut and added. They're supposed to go on next. I'm not going to. These feel like really small pockets, and pocket placement is pretty important for how things end up looking. And so I think I would like the rest of the pants assembled before I decide whether or not I like the idea of having these on. So the back sections are totally assembled. I'm now going to start basting them all together. So it's the side seams and the inside seams that go first, and then it's finishing out the crotch seam. And I'm gonna baste all of them because I don't know if I'm going to need to take it in for fit. So I will baste those seams together and then I'll do a fit check. All right, here's where we're at. It's time for a fit check. Because the top stitching is not in right here, this will fall like this. Normally, with most other patterns, this would have been stitched in place, which kind of holds it better. So in order to test to see how it's fitting, you're gonna either have to hold that in place or pin it in place. So I would say the fit's pretty good. The length is fine. I think because these are stretchy, I think if they were woven, I probably wouldn't do much. But because they're a little stretchy, I think I am going to take a little bit in at the side seams, which is what I did have to do for the skirt version that I made of this. But other than that, I think it's probably pretty good. I think I'll take in a little bit back here as well. So I'm gonna make those adjustments. Right now, this seam, this seam, this seam, and this are all basted as well as this one. So I will do that, and I'm leaning towards not doing the pockets. But I will make those fit adjustments, and then the next step will be assembling the facing. This has no waistband, so it will just have a facing here and carriers. Looking good. So they are all sewn and serged, and I even took the time to serge the bottom in order to get that ready for the hem. So all that's left is adding the carriers and doing the facing, and there's a belt that comes with this view that I am going to try to make, and the hem. So let's assemble the facing. Here are the three pieces to the facing, and they've all been interfaced. So it will be right sides together. One side has notches and one side doesn't, and that's how you can tell where they're supposed to be lined up. So once you get them pinned together, it will look like this. I'll have that curve. The next step that they tell you to do is to finish this end with like a serging and stuff. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm just going to baste it together, and then I'm gonna hold it up and make sure that it's the right size, because I have found with the two previous times that I made the skirt version that this wasn't the right size. So I will baste it, then I will measure it, and then the next step will be to finish these ends. So these ends will get serged and then folded down and stitched so that they're nice and finished looking. And that will be for both of them. There's also a belt for this version. One side of the belt is supposed to be interfaced, and then I did stitch it together. This pattern piece does specifically say that it has 3/8" seam allowances. So this is done at a 3/8" seam allowance. And then once you get both pieces sewn together with that 3/8" seam allowance, you would put the right sides together and stitch all around the outside at, once again, a 3/8" seam allowance. And you're not gonna wanna do the whole thing. You're gonna wanna leave an opening for turning it right side out. And then once it's turned right side out, they want you to do a whole bunch of top stitching. So the belt's right sides together. So I'm gonna sew everything except for a section about this big and then turn it right side out. The facing is basted together. So I've held it up and pinned it into place around the top of the pants, and it's almost exactly the right size, and which once again is hilarious because I took in this in 3 different places and I won't really need to on this. So I am going to sew these seams properly, and I'm going to serge these edges and fold them down and sew them. For the belt, it says on the pattern piece to do 3/8 inch seam allowance. So that's what I'm gonna do. Most things are at 5/8, but this one specifically says 3/8. Okay, the belt is stitched together, turned outside. I trimmed the seam allowances and pressed, and now they want you to do top stitching lines. I moved my needle over a little bit, and that way I'm gonna line it up with the side of the presser foot, and I'm just gonna go all the way along here, all the way around, and then I'm gonna go in one and do another line, and in one and do another line. So that's the first line of stitching, and now I just moved it in, and now I lined the stitching up at the edge of the presser foot. And I'm gonna do the whole thing again. Okay, and then this will be my final line of stitching for the belt. The belt is finished except for the buttonholes that need to go in it. And then these are cut in 3 3/4 inch lengths. So that is all of the extra that you have. So the carriers are ready to go. Here's where we're at. The facing is attached, so it lines up with this seam over here. So I want to serge this. This was supposed to be serged before, but I waited to make sure because I did have to take the facing in a little bit, and I didn't want to have to rip apart my serged edge. So the first time I made it, I found this very confusing. I thought that there was an error because the other types of pants that I've made, the waistband or whatever, will go to here. This is not an error. The notches line up just fine here. What they want you to do is to put right sides together of this fly shield, fly, whatever it's called on this side. And then you're gonna do your 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim this a little bit, and then when I flip it back, it's essentially going to look really neat and tidy like this. So I am going to do this serging, and then I'm going to understitch the facing. So I'm going to put the seam allowance together with the facing and stitch right along here. I'm going to do all of that before I flip this right sides together and finish off this seam. And then this will be pretty close to done. It doesn't tell you to in the instructions to stitch this down, but what I've done with both of the skirts that I made so far is once I had all that done, I would put the facing down, and then I stitched in the ditch of these seams to keep the facing nice and laying down, because otherwise it does want to kind of flip back up. So those are the next few steps. Here's where we're at. I'm leaning towards not doing the carriers or the belt, but I'll decide for sure. Right now I'm going to do the top stitching that goes along here that we couldn't do earlier because of how this facing all works. So I have it pinned, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch all the way around in all of those. All right, so here I am stitching in the ditch between this seam, and I'm just going down as far as the facing is. So I can feel that the facing is about to here. So that's where I'll stitch to and then lock my stitch. And
then this is how it looks in the inside.
Here it is. It's totally done. This is Simplicity 9755, and I paired it with the Sofie Sweetheart top. So I did not do a tutorial for making the top because, as it turns out, the Stay Stitch company, the people that put out the pattern, have a tutorial on their YouTube, and it's perfectly fine. So why reinvent the wheel? So you can find out how to do that on their channel. But otherwise, yeah, that was how you assemble 9755. And I think it turned out pretty cute. I've decided to just leave it without the carriers and without the belt and without the pockets in the back, because it has really great pockets in the front, and I just like the lines of it the way that it is. So there it is. Let me know what you think.